We have some COVID origin news, and it comes from the intelligence community and from a source whom, well, it's not too unexpected that it comes from him, and that's John Ratcliffe, the former Director of National Intelligence. Of course, he was only in that role for a few months, sort of the final few months of the Trump administration. And he's now told us something that we always expected and kind of always knew, but it's still lovely hearing it from him. And that is that the intelligence community always thought that COVID came from a lab. And of course, that's the opposite of what they were telling the public. And so the background to this is that before John Ratcliffe became DNI in 2020, the intelligence community on April 30th, and that date is very important. That's why I'm mentioning it here, and we'll discuss that quite a bit here. So April 30th of 2020, the intelligence community came out with a statement. And the statement said that, we'll just put it up here and just let's read it out here. So it says, the intelligence community also concurs that the wide scientific consensus that the COVID-19 virus was not man-made or genetically modified. So they agree with that consensus. So not man-made, not genetically modified, which is, of course, totally untrue. Of course, it's both of those things. So when Ratcliffe came in, and Ratcliffe is not responsible for this, he was not around when that statement went out. So when Ratcliffe came in, he asked his people to give him that evidence. Well, you guys issued the statement. What was that based on? And now Ratcliffe has admitted that there was nothing. They weren't able to give him anything. In fact, everything that he was given by the people within the intelligence community, of which he was the director at the time, said the exact opposite, that it came from a lab. So obviously this statement was a total fraud. And Ratcliffe now says that it was done for political reasons. I think that's really, really important, the political. And the other one is financial. We can discuss both of those. But anyway, that's where we are. So he's now admitted that. And yet, we have that statement.
What's important about that is he's kind of reignited a story that we've written on before. And that story basically focuses in on kind of the first 4 months, maybe 5 months of 2020 and what happened in terms of the response with COVID. And, Ratcliffe came in May, and that intelligence community statement had just been issued. And of course, he says, I want to see the back-end intelligence on that. And he finally gets his hands on the intelligence, and lo and behold, the intelligence doesn't say anything that provides any element of support for the IC statement. In fact, it does just the opposite. It says, that it appears that COVID came from a lab. And how do we know that? Well, we know that there was a State Department memo, and this is kind of what got us going off into looking at this. Is there was a State Department memo that was issued sometime probably in March, but possibly the very beginning of April, but more likely the end of March, that said that COVID definitely came out of the Wuhan. They didn't just say out of a lab, they pinpointed the Wuhan lab. Furthermore, that internal State Department memo, which Mike Pompeo sat on, also said that all the other theories that were being put forth, such as a zoonotic origin, a natural origin for COVID, were being done to distract from the real cause of COVID, which was a leak out of the Wuhan lab. So that the State Department memo identified 4 other competing theories and walked through them and explained why they were all hogwash. And again, felt so strongly about it that in their memo said that those theories were being introduced as a distraction from the true cause of COVID, which was a leak from the Wuhan lab. So, we started looking at those dates, and the more we looked at it, we found that there was 2 parallel and intertwining stories. And they were so complicated that, Hans, as you well know, we had to do it in 2 separate articles, and they're both up on our site. They're kind of towards the beginning because we put them out when we officially went off as truthovernews. And they discuss 2 things. One is Fauci's war with Trump and his war with Peter Navarro. So sort of this internal war that's going on in the Trump administration to keep information that might be said at, come out at all these press conferences. And then secondarily, we had an intelligence community war. And that war was, primarily designed to hide and obfuscate the origin of COVID. And one of the big questions that I don't think we really still have answers to, although we have a lot of thoughts about, are why was that being done? And Ratcliffe hints at that in his recent statement where he believed that it was being done for political and for financial reasons. And we've talked about in prior shows how many different elements of the federal government knew full well that the virus had originated of the Wuhan lab. There was 15 federal agencies that were part of the diffuse proposal, which is the blueprint for making COVID. They were there when that was presented. So, we'll delve into that a little bit more, but that's kind of the backdrop, is that we discovered there are these two intertwining stories that all evolved and basically went back and forth about hiding the origin of COVID.
Yeah, very much so. And I thought, and we already hinted at this a couple of times here, Ratcliffe's use of the word political is just hugely interesting in this whole context. Now, let's deal with the other one first, because it's probably easier. So what might be the financial interest in not talking about the true origin of COVID and trying to cover it up? Well, investments in China, supply chains, all that kind of stuff, the usual stuff, the economies being intertwined, which is a total disaster in and of itself, but it is where we are. It is what it is. So that's financial. But then he says political. They hid the causes of COVID and the origin of COVID for political reasons. Oh, what's that? And of course, if you look at the timeline that led to the release of that statement that we read out earlier, the one where the intelligence community says this came from nature, and it was not manipulated, and there was no lab. That statement, not only the timeline of how it got to be released, but the exact point in time at which it was released, tell us what was meant by political. And of course, the timeline that led up to this is that Trump had started, this is April of 2020, Trump had started talking about COVID coming out of the Wuhan lab. He was president. He had seen the intelligence. He had seen probably, I don't know if he saw the State Department memo, to be honest. I mean, Pompeo hid that, but he had obviously seen enough to make that conclusion. So he was becoming more and more sort of vocal in saying that. And this led up to April 30th of 2020. And Trump was giving a speech and was going to talk about that topic. And right when he was done, he was asked by the media about the statement that had just been issued by the intelligence community, the one that says that COVID is natural. So basically, the media was saying, hey, you're telling us it came out of the lab, but in fact, your own DNI just said it came from nature. And you can see how he was not prepared for that. I mean, he handled it quite well. He said, who exactly said that? What statement? Who signed it? He was trying to push back a bit in that exchange, but you could see they just, released that while he was giving his speech, basically to catch him out, and then pit him against them, which is one of their favorites. Where you saw that in Russiagate and so on. It's like Trump versus the IC. The IC knows better, whatever. So anyway, that the media had a huge field day because Trump said it came out of the lab, and exactly at the same time he was doing that, his own DNI said it came from nature. And after that, unfortunately, Trump started not talking about it so much anymore.
Yeah, I actually think it's maybe worth stepping back for a moment to give that event the proper weight that it's really due.
Sure.
And it's worth remembering that, of course, Fauci realized that, oh my gosh, there's some documents that are public that are going to make it clear that we were funding the lab in Wuhan. And of course, there's Defense Department funding that was flowing through and into EcoHealth as well. So there's the backdrop. We now know Fauci was overtly working to try to cover up the true origin of COVID and any of his involvement with that. But none of that was known at the time. Nobody knew that. So what happened is Trump was going through this evolving process of trying to understand what happened. Fauci was undercutting him at literally every turn in those first few months. That included fighting him on closing down flights from China. He resolutely was saying that it was a natural origin and saying it, as loudly as he could against anything Trump was saying, because Trump was sort of building towards this disclosure that he knew it was a lab leak, but he wasn't there yet. Now, simultaneously, we have the State Department memo, which comes out again. My best estimate is in late March. And Bill Gertz over at the Washington Examiner is the only guy who got a hold of this thing. And he wrote an article on it. And that article quickly got blackholed. But as soon as that article was published, maybe a little bit before, I'm sure they got word of it, that's when the intelligence community launched into creating this statement that they would finally publish on April 30th, which, by the way, was 2 days after Gertz's article hit, which then quickly disappeared. And people nobody saw it, and people didn't even realize there was a State Department email into it until, I don't know, 2 years later when U.S. Right to Know published it. So the intelligence community realized that this State Department memo was about to go public, which is why they rushed and they formulated this statement that said that COVID is neither genetically modified nor man-made, which, as you said, is exactly the opposite. It was both. And they coincide that statement, the release, not only with Bill Gertz's article that come out right after that, which just wipes that article away, but as you were talking about the story of Trump, who'd finally been slowly working up to full disclosure of saying it definitively came out of a lab in Wuhan. I've seen the evidence. And the DNI, Richard Grenell's DNI, which unfortunately for me raises some real questions as to whether Grenell was used, how much he knew or not, but he released the intelligence community statement and went through his office as Director of National Intelligence, which was, again, just a month or so before Ratcliffe came into that same position, and released it, but he released it without telling Trump. So Trump is, doing these daily press interviews. He walks up on April 30th, and he starts off by saying that he believes it's come out of a lab. He's immediately countered by media saying, we have this statement right here that was just released by your DNI. It's an intelligence community statement out of the Office of DNI saying that it's, basically backing the so-called scientific consensus, which is a lie unto itself, that it wasn't a lab leak. So everything that Trump had been building up to was completely hamstrung. And the media had a field day that Trump is spreading rumors. And so we went from being on the cusp of understanding at the end of April of 2020 that COVID rightly emerged from a lab in Wuhan to setting that entire narrative back where you then couldn't even talk about it. And if you brought up the lab leak theory, you were banned from Twitter, you were banned from Google, whatever. And that was the stage. So it was the mother of all leg sweeps. And it was a story that you and I have been, we've tried to get it out there, and finally, here's a chance to have it reinvigorated.
Yeah, it took long enough. I mean, it's four and a half years it's been. I think the overlooked part of all this, and hence again, Ratcliffe using the word political, is I think we've laid out now why this was an attack on Trump, which it was. It was to undermine him. It was to make him look like a conspiracy theorist. He's there, he's just given a talk. He's just said he's seen the evidence that came out of a lab, and then boom, he gets confronted with his own DNI statement. But I think it's even worse than that. It's not just sort of in the moment make him look bad. I think it cost him the presidency. If, as you just laid out, we would have all come to know in late April 2020, and by all I mean the general public as a whole, not just the people, the few people on Twitter who were looking into this very seriously at the time. If we'd all known, if the general public had known that this came out of the Wuhan lab, I think everything to do with COVID and everything that they tried to hang around Trump's neck would have just been forgiven and forgotten. Because how on earth are you going to respond to a virus that was perfected for human transmission in a lab? There's nothing you can do. All these mitigation measures, all this crap that they put out with the social distancing and the mask, all of that is absolutely useless because the virus was already perfected in a lab. That's never happened ever in human history. In human history, every time when there's a virus that jumps species, what happens is that it takes a very long time to adapt. So it gets into one person, but it has difficulty spreading to the next person because it just got lucky with that one person. Right. That it kind of, if you imagine like a key, the virus is a key that tries to get into the cells, and the cell is the lock. It's like a key that doesn't quite work properly, and it takes a long time. You have to wiggle it and so on. That's how it happens, if it happens at all in nature, which is very, very rare that the key would fit. But here, and then of course it doesn't spread. I mean, look at the original SARS. It's so much is talked about the original SARS. Oh, it was such a terrible event, blah, blah, blah. 774 people died of SARS worldwide. Not a
Worldwide.
single person in the United States died of SARS. Not a single person in the United States was infected with SARS in the United States. Someone might have brought it in, but not because the infection path was almost impossible because the virus had not been perfected. That's just the nature of it. And so what happened here instead is that the virus was already perfect to infect humans and to jump from human to human and to spread all over the map. And there's no chance to catch it. You can't shut it down at that point. So again, with the original SARS and the original MERS and all these original viruses where they do jump from a species to a human, you have time because the virus has to evolve and you have lots of time to shut it down. You find the people who have it and you can shut it down, which is exactly what happened with all the previous viruses, which were natural. But with this one, it was simply impossible. So again, coming to my main point here, if it had been known in April of 2020, which is exactly what Trump was intending to do by this kind of build up towards saying, yes, we know it came out of a lab, then who could have blamed him for it spreading everywhere? That was how it was designed. The lab designed it that way. And who could have blamed him for everything that followed, which is, in many ways, even if we forget about the mail-in, and even though the mail-in is connected with that, but even if we forget about every other story, Trump only lost by 40,000 votes in 3 states. I mean, that would have easily been made up by telling the truth about COVID, where it came from, and that Trump had no responsibility for where it came from, but also stopping it to spread, because it's impossible to let it to stop it from spreading when it was perfected in a lab. And that, to me, is the core of the story. And the intelligence community shut that down. And they shut it down not only to give Trump a bad day back in April 30th of 2020. It wasn't only about like embarrass him once at a press conference. It was about shutting him down altogether, about getting rid of him as president.
Absolutely. Just to give that some kind of background, just remember as I read this that already the internal State Department email had been done and it was about to get publicized. On April 17th, Trump told reporters in regards to a lab leak, we're looking at it. A lot of people are looking at it. It seems to make sense. There's a lot of investigation going on and we're going to find out. Fauci jumps into that conversation, claiming that COVID had a natural origin, and he cited the fraudulent proximal origin paper in that moment as proof of his claim, pretending that he didn't know who the authors were when Fauci was the one who directed the creation of that paper and even had a hand in editing it. That's on April 17th. April 26th, after that deception from Fauci, who just right there tried to publicly undercut Trump and lied on camera to do it, on April 26th, Trump cut all funding to EcoHealth. That tells you the progression. Trump now is, probably pretty confident. He's fully aware by the 26th. He's identified EcoHealth. EcoHealth as being the one working with the lab. He cuts funding to them. Then 2 days later, on April 28th, that's when Bill Gertz's article comes out and references the internal State Department email. April 30th, is now when Trump goes to the press conference. That's when the IC statement gets released. And again, Trump is completely leg swept at that press conference. I'm looking for it right here. So here, that April 30th, now that's when everything kind of comes to a head. Trump is coming out there and he's definitively going to tell the public it came from a lab, and he gets destroyed by the intelligence community release. 4 days later, there's a splashy May 4th interview with National Geographic. On the cover of that is none other than Anthony Fauci. So they filmed it a few days before, and it's a long piece. It's a big interview with Fauci, and Fauci goes on and claims in that there is no scientific evidence the coronavirus was made in a Chinese lab. And he goes on to tell National Geographic it could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated. Everything indicates that the virus evolved in nature. So Fauci had to have had that interview all lined up and ready to go before April 30th. So when you look at these events now with, through the benefit of hindsight, you can see how this was lining up, and it's kind of why we refer to it as two stories. The Fauci-Trump war with Navarro, it's also a war from Fauci with Peter Navarro, and the intelligence community kind of convening from two separate angles. So there's sort of two quasi-separate stories that eventually become one. And that's all of what Ratcliffe was referring to when he asked to see the underlying evidence and then said it appears to be both political and financial. And he says that because it was.
Exactly. Now let's get back to Richard Grinnell here, because this is a very interesting aspect of the whole story.
Unfortunately, it is.
Did he not see the evidence or ask for the evidence, which Ratcliffe very wisely asked for? I'm sure he did. And there's a little giveaway here. The only public thing that he said, that Grinnell has said, to my knowledge, on this infamous statement, the one that was intended to trip up and basically get rid of Trump, the April 30th one. The only thing that Grinnell has said is that he had to negotiate that statement, words to that effect. That always struck me as very odd. He was the DNI. He was the Director of National Intelligence. His office, it's signed DNI, issued the statement. Why would he have to negotiate his own statement? He can say whatever he wants. But obviously he couldn't. I think he said that he needed to negotiate it as a way of almost kind of, shifting the blame to others. And I'm sure that is true. I don't think he's a bad guy or whatever. But I do think he was not strong enough to get the truth out. It was all kinds of different interest groups, obviously most of them trying to get rid of Trump. And this is the compromise that was reached. And the compromise is actually very, very poor, because we already read out the part where it says that this virus did not come from a lab. Well, that's not true, but that's in there. I think the tiny little compromise that Grinnell got out of them being, all the other intelligence people, of which he was supposed to be the boss. Let's not forget that. But is at the end, it says something, we'll keep an eye on it. We'll kind of keep an open mind, or, words to that effect. That's kind of, to me, that's not good enough, because of course the media never mentioned that part. It's very weak to begin with, but the media never ever mentioned that. The only sentence the media has ever talked about is the one where it says it didn't come out of a lab, and Grinnell must have known that. So yeah, let's be honest, this is very disappointing. He should have, maybe he was too weak. He didn't have he was only in that position for a short while. Maybe that was the problem. I mean, we can come up with all kinds of problems. But still, the bottom line is, you do not issue that statement. If there's so much opposition and so much trouble and so much whatever going on in your office, and you don't have a handle on it, then don't issue it at all. Don't say anything at all. But to then issue a statement which, basically goes against your boss and was catastrophic to Trump, as we explained, is just terrible.
I think that highlights a couple of things. One, that the DNI maybe sometimes has power and sometimes doesn't. And what I mean by that is, if the office of DNI is filled by somebody who comes from the intelligence community, then it probably does have real power. If somebody steps into that position from a political side of things, like Grinnell did, who doesn't have any intelligence community background to speak of, he has no power. And I think that's partly what happened here. I have a couple problems with that, though. So Grinnell convened it on April 7th, which was the same day Trump sent out a tweet saying the WHO really blew it and we're going to be looking into the World Health Organization. Same day, Grinnell convenes the intelligence community and says he wants them to draft up their responses. And I think that's partly where Grinnell came into trouble, because he's implicitly asking for the expertise of the intelligence agencies. So that's where, he says he had to negotiate it, that's where it came into play, because he's now arguing the CIA, the FBI, all the intelligence agencies are telling him, this is our expertise. You don't have any expertise. You're just the guy who's kind of the hub. So I think that's where part of the problem that came into play, and I can forgive a lot of that. The thing that really causes me the greatest trouble in all this is the fact that Grinnell released that statement the same day that Trump was about to do an all-important press conference, and Grinnell didn't tell Trump he was releasing it. That's the hump. That is the roadblock that I can't get past. How would Grinnell possibly release that statement without having briefed Trump ahead of time? Trump walked into that press conference with no idea that the Office of DNI had released the intelligence community statement, stepped up to the podium to tell the world that he knew that COVID came out of the Wuhan lab, and he was absolutely just leg swept by that IC statement which came out of the Office of DNI. That's the element that I can't get past.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Now, my kind of remaining question here, I'm really glad that Ratcliffe came out and told us what really happened. Not that it's not unexpected, not that we didn't know, but it's just lovely hearing it out of the horse's mouth, isn't it? Like, well, I asked for it. I asked for all the intelligence. I asked for everything they have, and there was just nothing there, nothing to suggest this came from nature. So basically, the intelligence community knew from day one that this came out of the lab. But here's my kind of remaining issue. Why did Trump allow the whole process of telling the truth and coming out with the truth um, to be derailed by on that one day, April 30th? Why did he just not just forge on?
The
I
answer
have
to that
some
may
I
be
have
the
some
same
ideas,
answer
but
to Grinnell. It's possible that somebody was told something that was so undermining to the sanctity of the United States that they felt that, okay, maybe the lesser evil is to proceed ahead and allow this to just kind of go forward. I feel like something had to have happened at the level of Grinnell where he was just like, oh my God, this is so bad. We can't let this come out as much as I want it to. It may be that Trump was put in the same position. Maybe Trump just realized the politics were so bad, the optics were so bad, there was nothing he could do in that moment. I tend to personally lean more towards they got told something that would have been so devastating to the United States that they felt they couldn't say anything.
yeah, I'd like to know what that is, and I'd certainly like to find out. And definitely, if Trump is reelected, it should be one of the first things he talks about. He's got nothing to lose at that point.
Yeah, I don't
Um,
think he feels the same now.
no, exactly. We have one little data point that backs this up. The fact that something was kind of put in front of Trump, like, you can't do this. Whatever you do, you can't do this. Actually, we have two data points. One big one small one. The the data point the first one is the first one I thought of was Peter Navarro, who told us that and eventually they put him in jail because I guess he told us too many truths, right? Peter Navarro, and by the way, another thing about Peter Navarro is he was one of, I think, only two or three people who were with Trump from beginning to end. This is what is one of the problems of the Trump administration, that there was always too much. There wasn't this core group, and of course nowadays he does have a core group, and we've talked about this before. Anyway, Peter Navarro, while I'm talking about him, he was there from beginning to end, and what he said is that at some point in the summer of 2020, so after this whole April incident had sort of passed and so on, and it wasn't forgotten, but obviously Trump had not forgotten about the COVID origin thing. So Trump organized what was called a presidential commission on the origin of COVID, because I guess he figured the better way of doing it, rather than me going on press conferences and kind of coming out with this, let's give this some gravitas. Let's have a presidential commission, and they come out with this, and then I can just refer to them. It's actually kind of a smart way of doing it. And everything was set up, and then it was killed at the last moment. And according to Navarro, it was Mnuchin who killed it.
Yep.
And the argument was, you don't want to, upset China and so on and so forth. Now, I don't think that's enough. I don't think, Trump wasn't very happy with China, and he made that very clear. I mean, what else how could he have made that any worse? It just doesn't, supply chains, all this and that. I don't think, I think I agree with you. I think there's more to it. And then this gets me to the second little, a bit of data that we have is Trump did an interview some years ago where he was asked about origin. And he said there are some things he's not allowed to say. And this was after his presidency. So I'd say, in combination of all these different things, I'd have to agree with you. There is something there that we haven't been told. That something was dangled or shown, or it was like, and both Grenell and Trump, like, no, you can't go there.
Well, one thing I know for sure is the government doesn't want people asking questions about some of the other things that have sprung forth over the years, and maybe start out, looking into whether or not some other of these diseases, whatever, whether or not they actually arose naturally or whether they came out of a lab. So that may play into part of it. If people want to find the original article, it's called Fauci's Behind the Scenes War with Peter Navarro. And one of the things that came out of that research was this sort of unsettling understanding of what an island Trump really found himself on. I mean, as far as I can tell, like he kind of had Navarro and nobody else. Maybe you could argue also Kash Patel, not to, disparage him. But in terms of high-level people, he had Navarro on his side during the whole COVID thing and nobody else. And everybody else in his administration was pitted against him. That became very clear when looking into that. So, it just goes to show the way the structure was set up, it was kind of him against the establishment throughout the entire process. And I guess I'll note one other thing. We talked about the IC statement and the wording of it. There's a very eerie parallel between the IC statement on COVID and the 51 former officials letter on the Hunter laptop. And what did they do? Both of them are extreme falsehoods that quite literally, altered the outcome of an election. But they're also written in such a way, there's a little wiggle room that's placed very carefully and strategically into both of those statements where they probably can't be held liable. They should be, but they give themselves these kind of little outs, knowing full well, as the intelligence community does, because they're incredibly media savvy, knowing that the media was just going to go to the heart of the statement, that it didn't come out of a lab, that Hunter's laptop is a Russian disinformation. Now, there's language in that 50 with that Hunter laptop letter. We believe it has all the hallmarks of. But the IC wrote that for a reason. That's their carve out. They knew how the media would take that. They knew how the media would take the COVID statement. So.
Yeah, and conversely, if the other side ever issues a statement that has even the slightest bit of ambiguity about it, it appears that, or the hallmarks of, or in the case of the COVID statement where it said, well, if anything changes, we're keeping an eye on the situation or whatever. So you're absolutely right. The intelligence community, the Democrats know that they can issue these statements and all the media will cover is the headline. And they, like with the Hunter laptop, it was unreal. All the media headlines were intelligence community says Hunter laptop is Russian plot. Former CIA director say Hunter laptop is Russian plot. But as you say, the language leaves that wiggle room. But if the other side does it, let's say Trump issues a statement that has even the slightest bit of wiggle room, the media will only talk about the wiggle room.
That's exactly right. And it's just an unfair paradigm on which we're operating. And, it goes back to our long-held consensus that there's really no distinction between the media and the intelligence community and the government, that they're all just kind of one smooth-flowing entity, and people move back and forth on that. But that is what they did, and they did it twice. And quite literally, as you said at the beginning of this, it changed the outcome of an election.